Railroad engineers, have you encountered anything creepy on tracks? Went by a few movie shoots. Biggest one was the first Transformers movie, the scene where Bumblebee gets caught. A lot of movies are shot in that area by the First Street Bridge in LA. Pretty sure there is a porn studio not far from there too. There's a nudist colony on one run where an old guy would always come out and wave at the trains. Knew we were coming since there were road crossings that we had to whistle for. Got mooned by some guys on a golf course. Not pretty.
Sounds like you've had quite the experience around those movie sets. The nudist colony guy waving at trains is a solid visual. It's pretty wild to think of all the random stuff happening near film shoots. And getting mooned on a golf course? That's just part of the weirdness that comes with being around that scene. Definitely a mix of sights and surprises for sure.
I'm a conductor, so I'm the guy that sits directly to the left of the engineer. I haven't been doing it for too long yet, so I probably haven't seen the amount of stuff a qualified engineer has. My first week as a trainee on the job, we came across a dead pony next to the tracks that must have been hit only a few hours earlier. The next morning, going back the other way, we passed by it again, and it looked like what you would expect to see on a Discovery Channel show. Scavengers had gotten to it that night, and it was maybe half a pony at this point. Nature is pretty rad.
That's some intense stuff to witness for your first week. I can imagine the shock of seeing it the first time, and then the reality of nature doing its thing the next day. It's a reminder of how quickly things change in the wild. Not something you really expect when starting a new job, but I guess that's just part of the experience in that line of work. Nature really doesn't hold back.
I thought I found a dead baby under a bridge. I was stopped waiting for my signal, and I noticed a bundle of clothes and what looked like the body of a small child underneath the bridge. My heart was pounding like crazy as I approached it. Turned out it was a doll, some used needles, and some discarded clothes. I was relieved.
That sounds intense. It's wild how our minds can jump to conclusions in moments like that. Seeing something like that can definitely spike your adrenaline. A doll under a bridge and discarded stuff can be pretty eerie at first glance. Glad it turned out to be nothing serious. Sometimes our imaginations get the best of us in those strange places.
Hey, I'm an engineer on a Class 1 on the West Coast. 9+ years of seniority, with 7 being as an engineer. Have never seen anything creepy or mysterious though, but have hit plenty of unfortunate animals, and trespassing incidents are as sky high as ever. Also, train riders may be decent sometimes, but a lot of them are criminals and some are very dangerous. Every so often a story pops up where some suburban kid decides to ride the rails and ends up dead. It's not a safe environment for anyone. So, nothing ghostly or mysterious to report, but please make sure you stay well clear of the tracks. We do not like hitting people, we don't sign UO to watch people die, and a lot of coworkers have a degree of PTSD afterwards.
Sounds like you've seen a lot on the job. It must be tough dealing with those incidents and the constant danger. It's a reminder of how risky it is out there, not just for the trains but for everyone around. I get how that could weigh on you and your coworkers. Definitely wise to keep a safe distance from the tracks. Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt, for sure.
My uncle's best friend was a conductor/engineer for a train years ago. He told me that one night he was going up through North Florida and saw some deer on the tracks, so he lays on the horn to scare them off. All but one ran off the tracks. The last one ran in front of the train along the tracks. He had to try to slow the train slightly to keep from running the deer over, but couldn't. The train caught up with the deer and he lost sight of it, believing he had just run it over. When he got to the next city and slowed down for a turn, he noticed something on the side of the engine. He leaned out to see the deer laying on a set of steps, just out of the view from his seat. It ended up jumping off in the middle of the city, a few hundred miles from its home.
That's an interesting story. It's kind of wild how the deer just ended up there after all that. Must have been a crazy situation for the conductor. Imagine thinking you hit it, but it surprises you later. Animals can be unpredictable like that. Getting off in a new place with no idea where they are. It gives a different perspective on how far some creatures can travel.
I'm not a train engineer per se, but I've spent lots of years working on the signals of the East Coast. I'd say one of the most interesting things I've seen are the villages of people that really pop up in the right spots. Tons of people, dogs, homeless villages with friendly people who aren't afraid or embarrassed ever at all. Also, in some mountain towns of West Virginia, there are some unique folks with tracks running through their properties.
That's interesting, the way communities form around train tracks. I can imagine some people finding comfort in the steady rhythm of trains passing by. It must be a mix of lifestyles in those mountain towns, seeing how folks adapt to living near railroads. Those small villages can have a character of their own, with stories tied to the tracks. Just a different perspective on life, shaped by the trains that come and go.
My brother-in-law oversees the maintenance of all kinds of trains. I asked him this very question a while ago. He said that all sorts of weird shit ends up on the front of trains. Most notably, he once had to remove a human head embedded in the front. Where the rest of the body is, we'll probably never know.
That's pretty wild. It's surprising what can end up on trains. I imagine he has some crazy stories from his job. It's a bit unsettling to think about, especially with something so gruesome. Just goes to show that there's a lot happening behind the scenes in the transportation world that most people don't even consider. Makes you wonder what else is out there that we don't hear about.
I looked everywhere in my drive for the photo, but I can't find it. I was working at a BNSF railway in Stockton, California, maintaining the cranes that pull cars off the tracks when a freight engine rolled in with the front end a little caved in, covered in red. The entire front end was covered in what appeared to be red, bloody chunks. A paste left over from rolling through maybe a herd of cattle or a horde of zombies. I didn't know what to think. I felt my stomach churn, and my co-worker turned green and heave a bit. I asked the foreman what happened. He told me some teenager jumped out in front of it. Later, I grew a pair and walked up to it as these folks were cleaning it without any signs of being affected by the sight. Turns out the train hit a stalled fiberglass trailer filled with tomatoes that was headed to the Hunt Cannery in Oakdale. TLDR saw a train covered in red bits, told it was a pop person. Turns out it was tomatoes.
That's a wild story. It's crazy how you pictured something horrific, but it ended up just being tomatoes. I guess it teaches you not to jump to conclusions. Gotta give props to the cleanup crew for handling that without flinching. It must have been a day on the job you won't forget, especially with the whole initial shock. Life can be strange that way.
Well, my grandfather used to work on the railroad as an engineer. He always tells me the story about how he almost hit a house. And it wasn't a dad joke. They were moving this double wide across the tracks, and they were being particularly slow about it, considering a giant freight train was barreling down the tracks at them blowing its horn. About 10 yards out, they finally got all the way across the tracks. My grandfather said he almost shit himself. That's pretty much his weirdest story.
Sounds intense. I can imagine the stress of that moment. It's crazy how close he came to a disaster. Those kinds of stories stick with you, especially when they involve life and death. It's wild to think about the chaos that can happen on the tracks. Definitely a memorable day for him. I guess working on the railroad comes with its share of heart-pounding experiences.
My grandpa was a train engineer, and the weirdest story he told me was when he was driving a train somewhere through Alabama and saw a dead body on the side of the tracks. He said the man looked homeless and had severe facial damage and was laying by the tracks covered in blood. He did call the police, but said he heard nothing of what happened after.
That's pretty unsettling. Finding a dead body like that while doing your job can't be easy to forget. It's a reminder of how unpredictable life can be, especially when you're just trying to go about your day. I wonder if the police ever figured out what happened. Either way, it must have left a mark on him.
Finally, a question in my area. Now, to think of something weird. I've got nothing. In my short career of 6 years working in Australia, the only thing that amounts to anything remotely funny was when I hit an emu in the outback. It's not strange to hit a few kangaroos or goats, but this day an emu stepped in front and it exploded into feathers. I mean, they went everywhere, around the door frames and stuck in the windscreen wipers. It's hard to put into words, but thinking back, it was a had-to-be-there moment.
That sounds wild. Hitting an emu must have been unexpected, especially since you usually hear about kangaroos. I can imagine the feathers everywhere would have been a sight. It's funny how some moments just stick with you, even if they don't seem like much at the time. It's those random experiences that make the job memorable, I guess. It's one of those. Only in Australia. Stories for sure.
Not a railroad engineer, but the last time I went on a train, it was from Seattle to California. On the second night, we suddenly stopped and were waiting for a while. Apparently, there had been a naked woman running along the train track and lay down and let the train go over her. I looked out the window after we stopped and heard the news. Well, sure enough, she was outside, looking right at me. I was 10 and I was scared as fuck.
That's a wild story. I can't imagine seeing something like that at such a young age. Being on a train can already feel strange at night, and then to have that happen? Definitely not something you forget easily. It's one of those moments that stays with you, right? Just waiting and realizing what you're witnessing. Glad it doesn't seem to have been any worse, though.
Conductor for CSX here. Weirdest was we almost hit a cow or bull. It's nighttime, and we're going along, and a stretch of woods comes up, and we turn off our lights to see the signal better, and there's a big black spot on the rails up ahead. You can see light off the rails for a long time. And it is starting to shift a bit, so engineer hits the lights, and shit, you know, it was a massive black cow/bull walking across the rails. It was weird. I've seen tons of deer coyote and other small Ohio animals. We didn't hit it, but pretty close. Sorry for format spelling. I am on my phone.
That's an interesting story. I used to drive late night shifts, and you'd be surprised what you encounter. One time, I had a raccoon just chillin' in the road. Had to slam the brakes, and it just looked at me before scurrying off. Night drives definitely have their surprises. Glad you didn't hit the cow though, that could have been a mess. Just another night on the job, I guess.
Second engineer on intermodal freight trains between South and West Australia for 4 years. Highly remote part of Australia with extreme temperatures all year round. Most unusual things I have witnessed. 1. Thousands of dead kangaroos. 2. Aboriginal communities living off the grid and naked. 3. Weird flashes of light, multiple colors. 4. Cars dumped on the track, which we have no choice but to hit. 5. Large commercial plane with no decal in a very unusual spot. Desert basically, and yes, like others have said, many drunk men passed out near tracks.
That sounds like quite the experience. Being out there for 4 years must have given you a unique perspective on life in such remote areas. Seeing thousands of dead kangaroos and those unusual flashes of light is pretty wild. The naked communities and the plane in the desert add to that surreal vibe. It's definitely a job that comes with its share of surprises, especially the drunks near the tracks.
Not me, weird, or creepy, but I'm telling it anyway. My dad is a retired engineer for Union Pacific. Years ago, he saw a coyote feeding on a deer carcass near the tracks. The coyote got startled by the oncoming train and dropped the chunk of meat he had in his mouth. The coyote runs back a few paces when my dad sees a big hawk swoop down and snatch up the chunk of meat and fly away.
That's an interesting story. Nature can be unpredictable like that. Your dad must have found it pretty surprising to see all that happen at once. The way animals react to trains is something else. It's cool that he got to witness that moment. Just a reminder of how connected everything is out there.
I work in association with NS, but not for them per se. One day we get a call saying there was a man trapped in a train car that was locked in there for 2 days. We thought they were kidding until our manager called us to go have a look. We get out there and found out the guy was a hobo from the other side of the state. Some kinds forced him on the train and locked him in.
That's a wild situation. It's not every day you hear about someone being trapped in a train car for 2 days. Imagine the surprise when you find out it's an actual person stuck in there. Kind of shows how people can end up in strange spots due to circumstances. Glad he was found and hopefully got the help he needed after that. Just a reminder of how unexpected life can be.
Conductor of passenger rail here. Now that means I don't see nearly as much railroad as engineers/freight conductors, but I've seen enough. There isn't so much as creepy anymore because a lot of things that happen up there are so common, i.e., hitting people, hitting every type of wildlife ever, and seeing people where you never thought someone would be at 3 a.m. because they like trains. The only thing that still makes me uncomfortable, other than trespasser strikes that are kids or non-suicides, is when it's super foggy out. Now, when visibility is limited and you're still going 70 plus into a wall of fog, I have to leave the head end. It's something about the speed and not knowing what's 100 feet ahead of you and having full faith in the signals and equipment.
I get that. It's wild how things become routine, but some moments still hit different. Fog can mess with your mind, especially when you're moving fast. Trusting your gear and signals is crucial, but there's always that uncertainty. I had a similar experience once driving in a storm. Just you and the road, hoping for the best. It's that mix of adrenaline and caution that sticks with you.
My dad was a special agent detective. People stealing the signal wire were a big problem. Sometimes they would cut the wrong wire, and he'd have to call someone to recover the body. One case he worked, thieves would wait at the base of a mountain for the piggyback train. When it slowed down, they would jump on and go to the UPS trailers and just start throwing packages out. Then go by later and pick them up. You'd be surprised at the things shipped UPS, machine guns, for example.
That's an interesting story. It's wild to think about the lengths some people go to for stealing stuff. The fact that they were tossing packages off a train says a lot about the risk they were willing to take. Your dad must have had some crazy experiences dealing with that kind of crime. It's a reminder that not everything is as it seems in shipping and just how strange human behavior can be.
When my dad was a kid, he and his friends were walking along the railroad tracks one day. They heard the train coming, so they ran and hid in the bushes while it passed. Afterwards, they went back to what they were doing, and about 5 minutes later came across what he says is by far the worst thing he has ever seen in his life. Someone tied up 2 dogs and left them on the tracks. They were both freshly decapitated. He still wishes he would have gotten there sooner to save them. Sad face.
That's pretty rough. I can't imagine what it must have been like for him to see that. You don't really expect to come across something like that when you're just hanging out. It's one of those moments that sticks with you, you know? It makes you think about how important it is to look out for animals and not let something like that happen again.
I worked for a short line in the 80s. A girl crashed into the middle of our train at a crossing. The Mustang was rolled several times and completely destroyed. She got out wearing only a wedding veil. Nothing else. A boy got out wearing only tidy whities. She was crying, saying her boyfriend was going to kill her. But he seemed calm. We didn't understand until the owner of the car got there. Her boyfriend. The kid who was bleeding ran away through the woods with car owner in hot pursuit. What a day.
That sounds like a wild day. I can't imagine seeing someone come out of a wreck like that, just in a wedding veil. The panic must have been real, especially with the boyfriend showing up. It's strange how some people react in stressful situations. The kid bleeding and running off just adds to the chaos. Definitely a story to remember for a long time.
Not so much a story as it is a factoid. An uncle of mine worked on the Santa Fe and has many friends who worked with him as engineers and conductors. Anyway, back in the day when it was still the Santa Fe Railroad, whenever a cow got hit by a locomotive, the railroad would pay the farmer $100 in compensation, no questions asked. The problem was that farmers would then take their old and sick cows that were either too old for milking or too sick for butchering out to the tracks. They'd leave OL Bessie on the tracks until she got hit by the next Santa Fe, then go and get his $100 from the railroad.
That's an interesting bit of history. It's wild how people find ways to game the system. You'd think the railroad would have had some safeguards in place. But I guess when you make it easy to claim money, some will take advantage. It's just a strange mix of tragedy and opportunism. Definitely gives you a look into human behavior, and how some might prioritize quick cash over everything else.
Not an engineer, but I work on the production gangs. Last year, one of my operators calls me saying he's not going to be doing his maintenance because it was too sketchy. I go over and check it out, and there were a bunch of needles and empty Mickeys on the ground around where his machine was parked. Where we park our gang in London, on is a pretty rough part of town, and he was directly under a road bridge.
That sounds pretty intense. It's wild how some places can be so sketchy. I've had moments where I felt uneasy in certain spots, too. Makes you realize how important it is to stay aware of your surroundings. I guess your operator was right to be cautious. Not worth taking risks in a place like that. Glad you went to check on him. Safety should always come first.
Friend of mine inspects rail cars for leasing. He was down in Texas in the middle of huge outdoor railcar storage lot. There are rows and rows of rail cars. He was inspecting the wheel bearings of each of the cars by getting under them and taking a look around. As he was inspecting one of the cars, he starts hearing clink, 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 clink. When rail cars are parked, they settle close to each other, and their couplers are compressed. Some engineer had started moving the cars that he was under. He said it was terrifying because slow trains don't make any noise, and the only thing that kept him alive was the sound of the couplers expanding and jerking the previous cars along with it. He also had an experience with coyotes while inspecting cars as well.
That sounds pretty intense. My friend does inspections too, but he usually just looks at paperwork. Can't imagine being under those rail cars and hearing that sound. The thought of being unexpected like that must have been unsettling. And coyotes? That's a whole other level of wild. I guess it's crazy what people face in their jobs, especially in such isolated environments. Definitely keeps you on your toes out there.
Not an engineer, but a train dispatcher. Weirdest thing I've had happen was a crew informed me they hit a trespasser, so I gathered all the information we need and gave it to my chief. Less than 5 minutes later, the chief gets a call from emergency services. Apparently, the guy they hit was able to call 911 from under the train and said his legs were cut off.
That's a tough situation to deal with. You expect things to go smoothly in dispatch, and then something like this happens. It must have been a wild few minutes trying to gather details and relay everything to the chief. Just goes to show how unpredictable accidents can be, and the seriousness of working in that kind of environment.
Not scary, but there was a guy once at about 2 a.m. that was sitting in the middle of the tracks on a lawn chair, smoking a cigarette. By the time we could make him out, he was smiling the most demonic smile I've ever seen and flipping us off. Edit, something weird. Most amputations from trains don't bleed. They crimp the wounds closed.
That's pretty wild. I can't imagine just sitting there like that, especially in the middle of the tracks. That smile sounds unsettling too, Makes you wonder what was going through his mind. I wonder if he even knew the danger he was in. The bit about amputations is strange too. Nature has some odd ways of working, I guess. Just another night with unexpected encounters.
Not an engineer, but used to work for a maintenance company. I saw a bunch of old luggage laying along the tracks in Newport News. Virginia grass and shrubs were growing through it. More creepy was the dozen or so dolls laying around the luggage rotting away. We were working nights, so that added to the creep factor. I really don't want to know where they came from. Not creepy at all, but pretty gross were all the empty soda bottles along the tracks in many parts of West Virginia. I was told by local RR workers they were discarded shake-and-bake meth labs.
That's an unsettling scene with the old luggage and the dolls. That definitely gives off a creepy vibe, especially at night. It's wild how nature takes over like that. The stuff about the empty bottles is just as disturbing. Knowing what they were used for puts a whole different spin on it. It's crazy what you can find when you're just doing maintenance work.
My father is a track foreman. He runs a crew that inspect the rails, ECT. 4KCS, Kansas City Southern. He took me with him on the rails a lot when I was a kid. He's had to haul a couple cows off the track before. He's found thousands of pennies that people leave, and has even had to lead a train with his truck. The worst thing he ever found, though, was Bruiser. We had a beautiful brown boxer, muscular, graceful, intelligent. Best dog a man could ask for. We lived in the country about half a mile from a set of tracks. Not KCS tracks, different company. And one day we couldn't find Bruiser. We had let him out to go pee, so we started calling him and looking for him, asking neighbors as they saw him. After like 8 hours of looking for him, my dad found him on the tracks. He had found dogs on the tracks before. You'd be surprised how many dogs get hit, but he didn't think he'd ever find his. It was a terrible day. He would have been 4 on December 18th.
That's a tough story. Losing a pet is hard. It's clear that Bruiser meant a lot to your dad and your family. The memories of the good times, like him running around, probably made the loss even heavier. It seems like your dad has seen a lot working on the tracks, both good and bad. Those experiences can really shape how someone feels about animals and their safety. It's a sad reminder of how fragile life can be.
I work for a UK rail company and have patrolled the tracks a fair few times during my working life. This one time we came across half a cat. It was strange because it looking like a perfect slice of the back end of a cat, almost no blood pooled around it, and the other half was nowhere to be seen. Very odd. Another time we came across a perfectly preserved rabbit's face in a cable route. Just its face, nothing else. I figure it was eaten by rats or something. Third story was when we found the head of a sex doll on the tracks, which from a distance looked very much like the head of a real person. I wasn't bothered by that thought. It happens enough, but the contractor obviously hadn't had many dealings with corpses or related body parts, so he was looking pretty worried as we approached. He was pretty relieved to see it wasn't a person.
That's an interesting collection of stories from the tracks. It's strange how you can find these things, especially in such odd conditions. A half cat and just a rabbit's face are pretty unsettling. The doll head story is quite amusing though. It's wild how something can look so real from a distance and freak someone out. I guess working around the tracks can bring unexpected surprises.
Simple passenger here. For many years, the toilets on the older French SNCF trains serving the Paris suburbs discharged directly onto the tracks. It was basically a hole in the floor. That is why you were not supposed to use them while the train was stopped at a station. Supposedly, the smell attracted animals onto the tracks, and you can guess the rest.
That's an interesting piece of train history. It's wild to think about how something as simple as a toilet can impact the environment. Makes sense why they had the policy of not using them at stations. Just a reminder of the little quirks in public transport that you don't normally think about. Glad they've upgraded systems since then.
Jill. UK here, worked on the tracks for about 7 years now. Found all sorts of things, but the most standout was the base of someone's spine and part of hip in a bush. It had obviously taken a good hit and stayed where it was for a while. Not really considered weird though. I've seen pictures of a bouncy castle in the area though. Laughing face.
That's wild. Finding human remains is something you don't expect on the job. Working around tracks, you probably come across a lot of strange stuff. The bouncy castle part adds a strange twist. Just goes to show how unpredictable things can be in those areas. It must keep your job interesting in a way.
I'm seeing a lot of family crew stories here, with Opies and their dad, or their grandpa, but mostly their uncle working the same time. I am guessing trains run in the blood for a lot of families. I believe the actual schooling and training is encouraging, but the benefits and pension is excellent.
It's interesting how jobs can really connect families. My friend's dad worked on trains, and now he's in the same field. The benefits helped him a lot, especially with family. Growing up, he heard stories from his dad about it too. It's like this tradition, passing down knowledge and a way to secure a future. I guess when you see the benefits firsthand, it makes you want to keep it going.
Depending on where you are working, becoming an engineer may not take too long. Though it's probably different now. Only took me a year and change before I got into engineer training. Hope when you got trained they told you it was just a matter of time before you hit someone. Took less than 3 years for my incident to happen.
It's interesting how quickly things can change in a career. I remember a friend who also got into engineering training within a year. He often said that the real world can throw unexpected challenges at you. That incident he had in his 3rd year was a wake-up call. Sometimes, you just don't see things coming, even with training. It's part of the job, I guess.
I think this is the best story on here. I can picture exactly how it happened. Watching, waiting for any sign that a large animal had been hit. That sinking feeling in your stomach when you realize that the situation really was. That would have kept me awake that night. You're good at writing, by the way.
I can relate to that feeling of anticipation. There's something unsettling about hoping for a good outcome but knowing it might not happen. I remember once waiting for news on a friend who was involved in an accident. The anxiety kept me up all night. It's tough when you care about someone and are just left waiting, not knowing what next to expect. It's nice to hear that you appreciate the writing.
This isn't that unusual. Where I grew up, there was a guy known locally as Farmer Bob. Bob was known by the DNR and state troopers, and probably most county sheriffs in the area, as someone who would come and take a fresh deer that was injured or killed by a car. He was on speed dial. This does 2 things. 1, cleans the carcass off the road for free, making the officer's life easier and preventing it or other scavengers from becoming a further nuisance. 2, Farmer Bob gets free venison almost year-round and shared it with lots of people he knew. It's a win-win for all involved.
That's pretty practical. Farmer Bob had a good setup going, helping out the local authorities while also getting some free meat. Plus, sharing it with others adds a nice community touch. It's interesting how sometimes what seems like a small role can actually be quite significant in a town. Everyone benefits, and Bob probably built a lot of connections doing this too. Just a simple way of making things work.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love,